It was the early hours of June 6, 1944, D-Day. A young medic named Ken Moore landed hard in a muddy field just outside a small village in Normandy. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and for a moment he lay there, tangled in his parachute lines, listening to the chaos around him. Gunfire cracked in the distance, punctuated by the deeper thunder of artillery. Tracer rounds streaked across the dark sky like deadly fireflies. He tore himself free from his parachute and got his bearings. The village ahead was barely visible through the smoke and pre-dawn darkness. Moore knew he had to find shelter and link up with other medics. As he rushed toward the village, ducking instinctively at every explosion, he spotted a church with a tall stone steeple rising above the rooftops. More importantly, someone had draped a large red cross over its entrance, the universal symbol of medical sanctuary. He hurried inside, his boots echoing on the ancient stone floor. The church was centuries old, its walls thick and solid, offering at least some protection from the battle outside. There, kneeling beside a makeshift supply station, he found another medic, Robert Wright. Wright looked up, his face smudged with dirt and exhaustion already etched into his features, despite the battle being only hours old. The two men introduced themselves quickly, barely exchanging more than names and units before they understood what needed to be done. What followed would become one of the most remarkable episodes of the war. The silence of the church was soon shattered as the wounded began to pour in. Men stumbled through the doors on their own, or were carried in by their comrades, leaving trails of blood on the stone floor. With no supply crates, those had been scattered across the Norman countryside during the chaotic night jump. They had only their medic bags and the few first aid kits they could scavenge from the wounded themselves. The two men did what they could with the little they had: sulfanilamide powder for infections, morphine syrettes for pain, and bandages that seemed never enough. Outside, the battle raged as German forces pushed into the village, fighting house to house. The crack of rifle fire mixed with the distinctive burp of German machine guns. Inside the church, the cries of the injured filled the air, some calling for their mothers, others praying, many simply moaning in agony. The ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of prayers now echoed with the sounds of suffering. Moore could not sit idle while men lay dying in the streets. Protected only by the red cross painted on his helmet and the white armband with its crimson symbol, he ventured out into the chaos. The morning light was beginning to break, making him an easy target. Thinking quickly, he seized an old wooden wheelbarrow that had been left near the church, probably used by a gardener before the war turned this peaceful village into a battlefield. A German soldier spotted him from a doorway, rifle already raised to his shoulder. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Moore could see the man's finger on the trigger, but then the German's eyes found the red cross, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he lowered his weapon and stepped back into the shadows. Moore reached a wounded American paratrooper lying in the street, his leg shattered by shrapnel. With help from other paratroopers of the 101st Airborne who had taken cover nearby, they loaded the groaning man into the wheelbarrow as gently as they could. Moore then dashed back across the road through a storm of bullets. Though whether they were aimed at him or simply filling the air around him, he couldn't tell, returning the man to safety. Hour after hour, the two medics risked their lives to bring in the wounded. Moore made countless trips with his wheelbarrow, each journey a gamble with death. Wright remained inside, working frantically to stabilize the steady stream of casualties. His hands were constantly stained with blood, his uniform soaked with it. They worked with barely a word between them, communicating through nods and gestures as they moved from one wounded man to the next. As evening fell on that first terrible day, Moore carried another soldier into the church on a makeshift stretcher. This time the room fell silent. The murmur of voices, the groans of pain, even the whispered prayers, everything stopped. The man was not American, he was German. His uniform, though covered in mud and blood, was unmistakable. Moore laid him on a pew and began treatment, ignoring the stares of those around him. Some of the American wounded protested weakly, their voices hoarse. Wright soon joined him, and together they tended to the enemy soldier with the same care they had shown their own. Moore later explained, his voice quiet but firm, that these men were young, just like them, only wearing different uniforms. They were somebody's sons, perhaps somebody's fathers or brothers. After that first German soldier, more were brought in. Some came carried by their own comrades who had heard of the sanctuary. Others were brought in by American paratroopers who couldn't bring themselves to leave wounded men in the street, regardless of what uniform they wore. The medics treated them without hesitation, though it meant their limited supplies stretched even thinner. At one point, late in the first night, a German soldier burst into the church with his weapon drawn, the Mauser rifle sweeping across the room. The room froze. Wounded men who could move tried to shrink back against the walls, but when the German soldier saw his fellow countrymen among the wounded, lying side by side with Americans on the pews and floor, something changed in his face. He lowered his gun slowly, made the sign of the cross with his free hand, and left without a word. Recognizing the danger that one frightened soldier with a weapon could turn their sanctuary into a massacre, Wright imposed a strict rule: no weapons inside the church. He announced it in his limited German, and relied on translation from a wounded German officer who spoke some English. From that moment on, every man, American or German, left his gun at the door. A pile of rifles, pistols and knives grew near the entrance, a strange monument to temporary peace in the middle of war. As dawn approached on June 7th, American officers came to the church with grim news. The 101st Airborne would have to retreat and regroup. They were being pushed back by German counterattacks and could not hold the village. More critically, they could not take the wounded with them. There simply weren't enough vehicles or men to carry them. The officers expected Moore and Wright to withdraw with the unit. Moore and Wright refused. They looked at the men lying on the pews and floor, dozens of them now, American and German alike, and knew they couldn't abandon them. The officers argued, ordered, even threatened, but the medics stood firm. This was their aid station, these were their patients, and they would not leave. Finally, the officers departed, leaving the two medics behind with a few volunteers who chose to stay. When the Germans retook the village later that day, they too began bringing their wounded to the church. Word had spread among the German units about the American medics who treated everyone. Soon the building was so crowded that the floor itself became a hospital ward. Men lay shoulder to shoulder, the distinction between friend and enemy blurred by suffering. Those not expected to survive the night were placed closest to the altar, as if proximity to the sacred might ease their passage. Wright and Moore moved among them constantly, doing what little they could to make them comfortable. Later that afternoon, a German officer arrived with several of his men. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Wright, exhausted but resolute, met him at the door and told him through a translator that the no-weapons rule applied to all rank made no difference here. For a tense moment, the officer stared at Wright, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. Then, to everyone's surprise, he complied. He removed his pistol and sidearm, handing them to one of his men outside. He even thanked the medics in broken English for their work and promised to return within 24 hours with supplies and a German doctor. Wright nodded, too tired to feel relief. True to his word, the officer kept that promise. The next day he returned with bandages, medicine, morphine, and a German field surgeon who immediately set to work alongside the American medics. The battle continued outside, the village changing hands twice more over the next 2 days. But something extraordinary began to happen, something that seemed to defy the very nature of war. Whenever Moore and Wright ventured out to collect the wounded, and they continued to do so despite the dangers, the fighting paused. Word spread along both lines, the medics were coming. Soldiers on both sides, young Germans and Americans who moments before had been trying to kill each other, held their fire to let the medics pass. Some even helped point out where wounded men lay hidden in rubble or behind walls. For 3 days and 2 nights, the two men worked tirelessly, barely sleeping, eating only when someone forced food into their hands. They treated more than 80 soldiers, American, German, even 2 French civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. Their hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as exhaustion made their movements slower. All but 2 of those 80 men survived, a remarkable achievement given the severity of many wounds and the primitive conditions. The church itself narrowly escaped destruction multiple times. At one point, during a particularly fierce exchange of fire, a German mortar shell crashed through the ancient roof with a deafening crack. It rolled across the floor, spinning between the rows of wounded men who watched it with horrified fascination, too injured to move even if they could. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the explosion that would kill them all. By sheer miracle, it failed to detonate. The shell came to rest near the altar, smoke curling from its base but nothing more. Wright, without thinking, strode over and picked it up, still warm, possibly still dangerous. He carried it to the door and hurled it back outside into the street, then returned to his patients as if nothing unusual had happened. Later, when an American lieutenant tried to use the church steeple as an observation post to direct artillery fire, the medics refused absolutely. This was a sanctuary, not a weapon of war. The lieutenant, impressed by what the medics had created, agreed and found another position. The battle finally moved on, rolling eastward as the Allies pushed deeper into France. Other medics arrived to relieve Moore and Wright, and the wounded were finally evacuated to proper hospitals. The two men were reunited with their units and continued serving throughout the war, though they never forgot those 3 days in Normandy. When the battle finally ended, the church remained standing, scarred but intact. Today, it bears beautiful stained glass windows installed years later, honouring the medics and the liberating forces who fought for France's freedom. The pews still carry the stains of blood from that day. The church officials chose not to replace them, deciding that the marks were part of the building's history. A cracked tile near the altar marks the spot where the mortar landed but did not explode, and visitors often kneel there, thinking of the miracle that saved so many lives. Robert Wright, who survived the war and returned to America, expressed a wish to be buried in that churchyard after his death. Bureaucracy and regulations prevented an official burial, but when he passed away years later, his family made sure that some of his ashes were quietly brought to the churchyard, where a quiet plaque bearing REW marks the ground where the medic's journey ended. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to our channel and explore our other documentaries. Thank you for being part of Echoes of World War.